the IV line was rattling against the metal pole. Her heart rate was 127, her blood pressure was dangerously high, and the bruises on her arms were turning that sickly shade of yellow that meant they weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. Then her phone buzzed. One message. From him. Remember who made you. Don't embarrass me. Her blood pressure spiked to 162. The nurses scrambled. But it wasn't a doctor who came through that door. It wasn't the police. It wasn't her mother. It was the most feared man in the city. And he had one rule. Nobody touches what's under my protection. This is the story of how a mafia boss destroyed a powerful senator without raising his voice once. The fluorescent lights above bed 7 in the cardiac monitoring unit of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital hummed with a faint electrical buzz that no one else seemed to notice. But Marin Ashby noticed. She noticed everything now. The way the IV drip counted seconds like a metronome. The way the curtain around her bed swayed from the air conditioning vent positioned 11 inches to the left of the ceiling tile with the brown water stain. She noticed because noticing small things was the only way she had learned to survive the last 14 months of her life. Her vitals told a story the doctors were still trying to read. Heart rate, 127 beats per minute. Blood pressure, 158 over 102. Respiratory rate, 24, shallow and uneven. Oxygen saturation dipping to 93. Her hands, both of them, trembled against the bleached hospital sheet with a violence that seemed disproportionate to her small frame. She was 22 years old, to 5'4", and weighed less than she had at 17. The bruises on her forearms were fading to that sickly yellow-green stage, the kind that could be explained away. And they had been explained away, repeatedly. But the bruise on her left side, hidden beneath the hospital gown, was fresh, purple-black, the shape of knuckles. Nobody had seen that one yet. Her phone vibrated on the cold metal tray beside her bed. The sound cut through the steady beep of the monitor, like a blade drawn slowly across glass. Marin's eyes moved to the screen. Her pupils dilated. Her heart rate climbed 3 beats in 2 seconds. The monitor beeped faster. The message read, "Remember who made you. Don't embarrass me." She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't need to. The words were already inside her, embedded like shrapnel in the soft tissue of her psyche. She had read messages like this hundreds of times, maybe thousands. The messages that told her she was nothing without him. Messages that reminded her that her scholarship, her apartment, her mother's new life, all of it was a gift from him. Messages that ended conversations before they started. Messages that made her body respond before her mind could intervene. Her blood pressure hit 162 over 108. The cardiac nurse, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had been working the night shift for 11 years, looked up from her station. But she watched the numbers climb on the remote monitor and frowned. She had seen panic attacks. She had seen drug reactions. She had seen patients code and come back and code again. But what she saw in bed 7 wasn't any of those things. It was something quieter. Something practiced. It was the kind of fear that had been rehearsed so many times it had become the body's default state. Denise stood up and walked toward the room. She never made it. The door at the end of the corridor slammed open with a force that rattled the frame. Every nurse on the floor looked up. A security guard half rose from his chair. 2 orderlies exchanged a glance. The man who walked through that door was not a doctor. He was not a police officer. He was not family. At least, not in any way the hospital's intake forms would recognize. He was 6'2", dark suit, no tie. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he had not unclenched it in hours. On his eyes, gray, cold, unblinking, swept the corridor the way a general surveys a battlefield. 2 men flanked him, both in dark coats, both with the particular stillness of people who had been trained never to move first. Every person in that hallway recognized him, not because they had met him, because in this city, you didn't need to meet Derek King to know exactly who he was. He walked directly to the nurse's station. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. And he placed one hand on the counter, leaned forward, and spoke in a tone that was quieter than the ventilation system above. "Room number." Denise, who was not easily intimidated, and who had once talked a man with a knife into putting it down during a psych hold, felt the hair on her arms rise. "I need to know your relation to the patient, sir." Derek's eyes didn't move from hers. "I'm the man who's going to make sure she walks out of here alive." "Room number." There was a silence that lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Denise made a decision she would later describe to investigators as instinctive. "Bed 7, end of the hall." Derek straightened, adjusted one cuff, walked. Behind him, one of his men stayed at the door. The other followed at a distance of exactly 8 feet, close enough to respond, far enough not to crowd. When Derek reached the doorway of room 7, he stopped. He looked at the girl on the bed, and he saw the trembling hands. He saw the monitor numbers. He saw the phone on the tray. He saw everything, and without raising his voice, without clenching a fist, without making a single threat, he said, "Nobody touches what's under my protection." Marin Ashby looked up. Through the fog of dissociation and the chemical haze of whatever they had given her through the IV, she looked at this man she had met exactly once, at a fundraiser 9 weeks ago, for 30 seconds. In a conversation she barely remembered, and she saw something she had not seen in 14 months. She saw someone who was not afraid. 14 months earlier, Marin Ashby had been the kind of person that professors remembered. She was a senior at Whitmore University, double majoring in political science and economics, carrying a 3.91 GPA, and she had just been accepted to the honors thesis program that only 12 students per year were invited to join. She had a small apartment near campus that she shared with a girl named Tess, who left passive-aggressive notes about the dishes and played folk music at 7 in the morning. She had a part-time job at the university's writing center. She had a mother named Claudette, who called every Sunday and who worked as an office manager at a real estate firm in a city 3 hours away. Marin's life was not glamorous, but it was hers. Every piece of it, the ramen budgets, the library hours, on the second-hand winter coat, was something she had built with her own hands and her own discipline. That ownership mattered to her more than most people understood. What is he? It ended on a Tuesday in October. Claudette Ashby had been dating a man named Russell Graves for about 3 months when she brought him to Parents' Weekend at Whitmore. Claudette was 51, still attractive in the way that certain women manage through sheer force of effort. Yeah, and she had spent most of her adult life managing money she didn't have. Marin's father had left when Marin was 4. There had been no child support. There had been no second chances. Claudette had raised her daughter on willpower and spreadsheets, and the invisible weight of that effort had calcified into something that looked like ambition, but was really exhaustion, dressed up in lipstick. Russell Graves was 47 years old. He was a state senator representing the 14th District, which covered most of the affluent suburbs north of the city. He had held the seat for 3 terms. Before that, he had been a corporate attorney. Before that, he had been the kind of college student who knew every dean by first name. He was tall, silver-templed, square-jawed, and he spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had learned very early that confidence is a performance, and that most people cannot tell the difference between the performance and the real thing. And he was also the single largest private donor to St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, where his name was engraved on a brass plaque outside the cardiology wing he had funded. He was friends with the mayor. He golfed with the district attorney. He had the personal cell phone numbers of 3 federal judges and the chief of police. He sat on the boards of 2 charities and 1 private school. His public image was so thoroughly constructed that questioning it felt, to most people, like questioning gravity. When Russell met Marin at Parents' Weekend, he shook her hand with both of his and told her that her mother talked about her constantly, that she must be extraordinary to have accomplished so much with so little, and that he was thrilled to finally meet the young woman who had made Claudette so proud. Marin felt something that day. Not attraction, she would later clarify this under oath, but a kind of warmth that she associated with the father she had never had. Russell was attentive without being aggressive. He asked questions about her thesis and actually listened to the answers. He laughed at her dry humor. He told Claudette in front of Marin that she had raised a remarkable daughter. 2 weeks later, Russell offered to fund Marin's graduate school applications. The offer came through Claudette, who presented it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He wants to invest in your future, honey. That's what good men do. Marin said no, politely, firmly. Russell respected the refusal. He did not push. He did not mention it again. Instead, he simply began appearing at Claudette's birthday dinner, at Thanksgiving, at the holidays. He brought thoughtful gifts, a first edition of a book Marin had mentioned once in passing, a cashmere scarf in the exact shade of blue she always wore. He remembered things. He paid attention. He made Claudette happy in a way Marin had never seen, and Marin, who had spent her entire life watching her mother struggle, wanted desperately to believe that this happiness was real. The relationship between Russell and Marin shifted sometime around February. Later, Marin would struggle to identify the exact moment, because that was the nature of the shift. It was not a single event, but a gradient, a slow change in temperature that you didn't notice until you were already burning. It began with concern. Russell would text her, "Just checking in. I'm making sure you're safe. Your mom worries." And it felt caring. Then the texts became more frequent. Then they became expectations. If she didn't respond within 30 minutes, he would call Claudette, who would call Marin in a panic, and Marin learned that it was easier to respond immediately than to deal with the cascade. Then it became guidance. Russell began offering opinions on her course schedule, her friends, her wardrobe. "That skirt is a bit much for a classroom. Don't you think?" He framed everything as wisdom, as the perspective of someone older and more experienced, and when Marin pushed back, he would smile gently and say, "I'm not trying to control you, Marin. I'm trying to protect you. There's a difference." The first time he crossed a physical line was in April. Marin was at Claudette's apartment for a weekend visit. Russell was there, as he always was now. Marin mentioned that a classmate, a male classmate, had invited her to a study group. Russell went quiet. Not angry, just quiet. That particular kind of quiet that fills a room like gas before a spark. Later, when Claudette was in the kitchen, Russell placed his hand on Marin's knee and said very softly, "You need to be careful about the signals you send, Marin. Men will take advantage of a girl like you." She moved his hand. He smiled. He did not try again that night. But the architecture of control had already been built. By May, Marin had stopped attending the study group. And by June, she had changed her phone password to one Russell suggested for security. By July, she had moved out of her apartment with Tess. Russell had found her a better place, a studio in a nicer building that he paid for, where the doorman knew his name and reported Marin's comings and goings. Claudette saw none of this. Or rather, Claudette saw all of it and chose to interpret every piece as evidence of Russell's generosity. When Marin tried to talk to her mother about feeling suffocated, Claudette's response was swift and practiced. "Do you know how many women would kill for a man who pays this much attention? You're being ungrateful, Marin. You're being a child." The gaslighting from Russell was more sophisticated. He never raised his voice. He never issued ultimatums. He simply rearranged reality, one conversation at a time, until Marin could no longer trust her own perceptions. If she said she felt controlled, he produced evidence of his generosity. If she said she was unhappy, he reminded her of everything she had before him, and everything she would lose without him. If she cried, he held her and whispered, "I'm the only one who really understands you, Marin. Everyone else will hurt you. I'm the only one who won't." By September, Marin had stopped seeing her friends. By October, 1 year after that parents' weekend handshake, she had dropped out of the honors thesis program. By November, she had stopped going to classes entirely. And she spent most of her time in the studio apartment Russell paid for, waiting for his texts, responding within minutes, wearing the clothes he approved of, eating when he said she should eat, sleeping when he told her to rest. She had panic attacks that came without warning. Her heart would race, her vision would blur, her hands would go numb. The first time it happened, she called Russell. He came immediately, held her, stroked her hair, and said, "Wow, this is what happens when you try to do too much without me. Let me take care of you." She believed him. The first time he hit her was December 14th. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was a Tuesday evening. Maren was sitting on the couch in her apartment, and Russell was standing by the window, on the phone with someone from his office. Maren's phone buzzed. It was a text from Tess, her old roommate, asking if she was okay, saying she hadn't heard from her in months. Maren, without thinking, started typing a reply. Russell ended his call, walked over, took the phone from her hands, read the message, read her half-typed reply, and then, with the casual precision of a man swatting a fly, he backhanded her across the left side of her face. The sound was nothing, a dull, flat impact, like dropping a book on a table. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said, "I told you about her." He set the phone down on the coffee table, adjusted his cufflinks, and left the apartment. Maren sat on the couch for 47 minutes without moving. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She stared at the wall and felt something inside her rearrange itself, like furniture being moved in a room she couldn't see. That night, Russell sent her flowers. The card read, "I love you more than you know. Let's have dinner Friday." She went to dinner on Friday. The hits were not frequent. They were strategic, and they came only when Maren attempted to exercise any form of independent thought. When she questioned his schedule, when she mentioned a friend, when she expressed a desire to return to school. The violence was never excessive. It was calibrated, a slap, a grip hard enough to bruise, once a push that sent her into the edge of a counter. Each time it was followed by remorse that felt genuine, by gifts that felt like love, by whispered assurances that it would never happen again. And each time, the part of Maren that had once been capable of independent judgment shrank a little more, retreating into a smaller and smaller room inside her own mind, until she could barely remember what it felt like to think a thought that Russell hadn't planted there first. The hospitalization happened on a Friday night in December, exactly 1 year after the first hit. Maren collapsed in the lobby of her apartment building. The doorman, a man named Gerald, who had been quietly horrified by what he observed for months, called 911 instead of calling Russell. Paramedics found Maren on the floor, hyperventilating, tachycardic, with blood pressure high enough to risk a stroke. They noted the bruises, old and new, on her arms. They noted the bruise on her ribcage that she tried to cover with her hand. They noted the way she flinched when the male paramedic reached for her wrist. She was brought to St. Augustine Memorial Hospital at 9:47 p.m. and admitted to the cardiac monitoring unit for observation. The attending physician was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cardiologist in her mid-40s who had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the constellation of symptoms. The tachycardia, the trembling, the hypervigilance, the flinch response, the inconsistent explanations, the fear that had nothing to do with the medical equipment. Dr. Vasquez ordered a full workup and then did something that would prove critical. She flagged the case in the hospital's internal system with a DV notation, not in the official chart, where it could be contested, but in her own clinical notes, which were encrypted and backed up to a personal server. She also took photographs of every visible mark on Maren's body, with Maren's whispered consent, and stored them in the same encrypted file. At 10:15 p.m., Dr. Vasquez called the hospital's social worker. At 10:22 p.m., Claudette Ashby arrived. She was breathless, panicked, and immediately began minimizing. "She's been under a lot of stress. School, you know. She's always been anxious. It runs in the family. She'll be fine. She just needs rest." Dr. Vasquez looked at Claudette for a long time. Then she said, "Mrs. Ashby, your daughter has injuries consistent with repeated physical trauma. I am required by law to report this." Claudette's face went white. Then it went hard. My daughter is in a relationship with a very important man who takes excellent care of her. Whatever you think you see, you're wrong, and I would be very careful about what you put in that chart. Dr. Vasquez did not blink. She made her notes. She filed her report. At 11:04 p.m., Russell Graves arrived at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. He arrived the way he arrived everywhere, with authority. And he walked through the main entrance, greeted the security guard by name, nodded to the receptionist, and made his way to the cardiac unit without signing in, without asking directions, without being stopped, because this was his hospital. His name was on the wall. His money had paid for the machines that were keeping Marin's heart rate monitored. And in Russell Graves's mind, that meant he owned everything inside these walls, including the girl in bed 7. He paused at the nurse's station, long enough to smile at the charge nurse and say, "I'm here for Marin Ashby. She's family." No one questioned him. He walked into room 7 and closed the door behind him. Russell stood at the foot of Marin's bed and looked at her the way a man looks at a car that has broken down in an inconvenient location. "You need to come home," he said. His voice was flat, efficient, stripped of the warmth he performed in public. And this was the real Russell, the one who only existed behind closed doors, in empty rooms, in the spaces between what he said and what he meant. Marin's hands were trembling. They had not stopped trembling since the paramedics had loaded her into the ambulance. But when Russell spoke, the trembling intensified, as if her body was translating his words into a frequency that only her nervous system could hear. "They want to keep me overnight," she whispered, "for observation. My heart rate." "Your heart rate is fine. You had a panic attack. You've had them before. I'll speak to the doctor and we'll have you discharged within the hour." "Russell, I don't—" "Marin." He said her name the way a teacher says a student's name when they have given the wrong answer for the 3rd time. Patient. Disappointed. Final. We are not having this conversation here. In a hospital. Where anyone could hear. Do you understand what it would look like if people found out you were here? Do you understand what that does to me?" She said nothing. He adjusted his tie, straightened the lapel of his coat, pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down, not to comfort her, but to reduce the distance between his mouth and her ear. "I'm going to call Dr. Preston. He's the chief of medicine. He and I have an understanding. He'll process your discharge, we'll go home, and tomorrow this will be something we don't talk about, just like everything else." Marin stared at the ceiling. From the fluorescent light buzzed. The monitor beeped. Her blood pressure was climbing, but she didn't know that because Russell had positioned himself between her and the screen. "I want to stay," she said. The words were so quiet they barely existed. They were not defiance. They were not courage. They were the last exhalation of a person drowning, not a call for help, but a final bubble rising to the surface. Russell heard them. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared by 2 millimeters. And his left hand, which had been resting on his knee, closed into a fist and then opened again. These were the tells, the micro-expressions that Marin had learned to read the way a sailor reads clouds before a storm. "What did you say?" "I said I want to stay. Just tonight, I need to rest, please." Russell stood. He walked to the window. He looked out at the parking lot for 6 seconds. Then he turned around. "You want to stay," he repeated. "In a hospital. Yes, where they're going to ask questions. Where they're going to look at you and assume things about me. About us. Is that what you want, Marin? To sit here and play the victim while I go home and wonder what you're telling these people?" "I'm not telling anyone anything." "No, you're not, because there's nothing to tell, is there?" She didn't answer. "Is there, Marin?" "No." "Good. Then get dressed. I'll pull the car around." She didn't move, not because she was being defiant, because her body physically would not obey. The trembling had escalated to full body shaking, and her legs felt like they were filled with sand. The panic attack that had put her on the floor of her apartment lobby was not over. It had merely paused, and Russell's presence was the trigger that restarted it. "Marin, get up." "I can't." "You can and you will." "My legs, I can't feel." "This is exactly what I'm talking about." Russell's voice had dropped to a whisper. But the whisper was worse than shouting. It was intimate and cold, like a knife pressed flat against skin. This is the drama. This is the performance. You do this every time. You create a crisis. You make yourself the center of attention, and then I have to come fix it. Do you ever think about what that does to me? Do you ever consider for 1 second that your weakness has consequences? Marin's eyes filled with tears. Not the kind that fall freely, the kind that pool and burn and stay, because she had learned that crying in front of Russell made things worse. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't apologize. Just get up. She tried. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, and the room tilted. The IV pulled at her arm. The monitor alarm chirped as the leads shifted on her chest. I can't do this right now, she said. And then, because the panic had reached a place beyond his control, beyond her conditioning, beyond everything she had been taught to suppress, she said something she had not said in 14 months. I think I need help. The silence that followed was catastrophic. Russell's face underwent a transformation that took less than 1 second, but contained an entire geology of rage. His mask, the public face, the senator's face, the face that smiled at cameras and shook hands and promised fiscal responsibility, cracked, not along the edges, through the center. And what emerged from the crack was something Marin had seen before, but only in glimpses, only in the moments between the hit and the apology, only in the fraction of a second when his eyes went flat and dead, and she understood with animal certainty that this man was capable of anything. He stepped forward, his right hand came up, and he slapped her across the face. It was not a hard slap, not by the standards of what he had done before. It was reflexive, impulsive, in the spasm of a man whose control had slipped for exactly 1 second. The sound it made was sharper than it deserved to be, a crack that echoed off the tile walls and the metal bed frame and the linoleum floor. Marin's head snapped to the right, her cheek flushed red. Her monitor went haywire, heart rate spiking to 141, blood pressure surging, oxygen dropping, and then the door opened. Denise Okafor, the cardiac nurse. It had been walking toward the room because the telemetry readings had triggered an alert at her station. She opened the door at the exact moment Russell's hand made contact with Marin's face. She saw it. She saw the slap. She saw Marin's head turn. She saw Russell's hand still raised. She saw the expression on his face, not guilt, not shock, but the cold calculation of a man assessing how much damage a witness could do. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then Russell Graves did what Russell Graves always did. He lowered his hand. He straightened his posture. He breathed once, deep, controlled, and the mask reassembled itself with a speed that was almost mechanical. By the time he turned to face Denise, he was smiling. She's having an episode, he said. His voice was warm, concerned, pitched to the frequency of a man who loved deeply and worried constantly. She gets hysterical when she's scared. And I was trying to calm her down. Sometimes a firm touch helps snap her out of it. Her therapist recommended it. Denise stared at him. She had been a nurse for 11 years. She had been lied to by patients, by families, by doctors, by insurance companies. She knew what a lie looked like. And this was the most polished, most practiced, most dangerous lie she had ever seen. I need to check her vitals, Denise said. Of course, take your time. I'll step outside. He walked out of the room. While he walked past Denise without making eye contact. He walked down the corridor and around the corner, and then he pulled out his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession. The first call was to Dr. Edwin Preston, Chief of Medicine at St. Augustine Memorial. Edwin, it's Russell. I need a discharge order for a patient in the cardiac unit. Marin Ashby. Bed 7. Tonight. The second call was to Jeffrey Holt, the hospital's director of operations. Jeff, we need to talk about the security footage from the cardiac floor. I need the last 30 minutes reviewed and archived. You understand what I mean by archived. The third call was to his chief of staff, a woman named Karen Brightwell, who had been managing Russell's public image for 8 years, and who had made more problems disappear than a fixer in a spy novel. Karen, St. Augustine, there may be a situation. I need containment, full protocol. Back in room 7, Denise was checking Moran's vitals. Moran's cheek was red. Her heart rate was 138 and climbing. Her blood pressure was in hypertensive crisis territory. Oda, and she was staring straight ahead, at nothing, with the fixed, unfocused gaze of someone who has left their body and is watching from somewhere else. Denise had seen that look before. It was called dissociation. It was the mind's emergency exit when the body could not escape. Marin, Denise said softly. Marin, can you hear me? No response. Marin, I need you to listen to me. I saw what happened. I saw what he did. And I need you to know that you are safe right now. He is not in this room. You are safe. Marin's eyes moved, slowly, like a camera refocusing. She looked at Denise and said, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone much younger, he's going to make you erase it. Erase what? Everything. He'll call the director. He'll call Dr. Preston. He'll make it go away. He always makes it go away. Denise felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, anger, the specific kind of anger that comes from watching a system fail the people it was built to protect. Not this time, she said. She didn't know yet if that was true, but she said it anyway. 20 minutes later, the machinery of Russell Graves's power began to move. Dr. Preston appeared on the cardiac floor, unusual for the chief of medicine at 11 p.m. on a Friday, and pulled Dr. Vasquez aside. Their conversation, conducted in hushed tones in the break room, lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, Dr. Vasquez walked back to her station with a face that could have been carved from stone. What did he say? Denise asked. He wants me to discharge Marin Ashby. He says the senator believes continued hospitalization is unnecessary and potentially harmful to the patient's mental state. That's insane. Her blood pressure is... I know what her blood pressure is. Then you're not going to do it. Dr. Vasquez looked at Denise. In her eyes was the calculation of a woman weighing her career against her conscience. I am going to document everything I've seen. I am going to photograph every injury. I am going to enter my clinical notes in a system that Dr. Preston cannot access. Yeah, and then I am going to do whatever I have to do to keep that girl in this hospital until morning. And Preston. Preston can explain to the medical board why he tried to override a cardiologist's clinical judgment on a patient in hypertensive crisis. But Russell wasn't done. At 11:45 p.m., Jeffrey Holt appeared on the floor. He spoke to the security desk. He spoke to the tech department. Within 20 minutes, the security footage from the cardiac floor for the period between 10:30 and 11:15 p.m. had been flagged for system maintenance review, a bureaucratic euphemism that meant the footage was being moved to a restricted server where it could be quietly deleted. At midnight, Russell returned to the floor. He was accompanied by a man in an expensive suit, who introduced himself as the hospital's general counsel, and who informed Dr. Vasquez that Senator Graves was prepared to reconsider his annual $2.3 million donation if the hospital's medical staff continued to interfere with the family's wishes regarding patient care. Dr. Vasquez held her ground, but the walls were closing in. She could feel it, the weight of institutional pressure, the unspoken understanding that Russell Graves was not merely a donor, but a pillar, and that pillars do not move. People move around pillars. At 12:17 a.m., Claudette Ashby arrived for the second time that night. She had been called by Russell. She walked into her daughter's room, sat beside the bed, took Moran's hand and said, "Sweetheart, let's go home. Russell has a car waiting. You'll feel better in the morning." Moran looked at her mother with eyes that were red-rimmed and ancient. "He hit me, Mom. Here, in the hospital." The nurse saw it. Claudette's hand tightened on Moran's. When something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been horror, might have been recognition, might have been the ghost of every warning sign she had chosen to ignore. But then the flicker died, and Claudette said, "He was trying to help you, Moran. You were hysterical. Sometimes people have to be firm." Moran pulled her hand away. And at 12:34 a.m., the door at the end of the corridor slammed open. Derek King walked in. Derek King had built his empire the way a surgeon builds a career, with precision, patience, and an absolute intolerance for error. He owned 17 hotels across 3 states, a construction firm that held contracts with 4 municipalities, and a real estate portfolio valued at figures that financial journalists described as estimated, because the real number would require more digits than their columns could hold. He was 35 years old, and he had been arrested twice, once at 19 for assault, once at 22 for racketeering, and both cases had been dismissed due to what prosecutors privately called evidentiary complications, which was a polite way of saying that the witnesses had developed sudden and inexplicable cases of amnesia. The arrest record was real, so was the world it came from. Derek had grown up in a neighborhood where power was not something you voted for. It was something you took, or something that was taken from you. His father had been a loan shark who died of a heart attack at 51. His mother had been a seamstress who died of cancer at 44. Derek had been 18 when he buried her, and he had sworn at her grave that he would never be poor again, and he had kept that promise with a ruthlessness that frightened even the men who worked for him. But Derek King at 35 was not the same man who had been arrested at 19. The rage was still there, banked, controlled, converted into something more useful than violence. He did not shout, he did not threaten, he did not hit. He had rules, strict rules. Rules that governed every aspect of his organization, from the men who ran his construction crews to the women who managed his hotel lobbies. And the first rule, the one that was carved into the foundation of everything he built, was this: no one under his protection gets touched. No one. The rule was not sentimental, it was structural. Derek had understood since he was a child watching his father squeeze payments out of widows, that violence against the vulnerable was not a demonstration of power. It was a confession of weakness. It was the act of a man who had nothing left in his arsenal, who had exhausted every form of control and had been reduced to the animal simplicity of physical force. And Derek King despised weakness the way most people despise disease. He had met Marin Ashby exactly once, 9 weeks before her hospitalization, at a charity gala hosted by the city's Chamber of Commerce. Derek had been there because he owned the hotel where the gala was held. Russell Graves had been there because Russell Graves was always at events where rich people gathered to feel good about themselves. Marin had been there because Russell had told her to be there. In wearing the dress Russell had chosen, standing at the distance Russell had specified, close enough to be seen, far enough not to be heard. Derek noticed her in the way that a man who has spent his life reading rooms notices anything out of place. She was standing by the bar, not drinking, holding a glass of water like a prop. Her eyes were moving constantly, tracking Russell, tracking the room, tracking exits. Her posture was rigid in a way that suggested not confidence but compliance. And when Russell walked toward her, she didn't brighten, she braced. It took Derek 15 seconds to read the situation. He had seen it before, not in this setting, not in the crystal and canapé world of charity galas, but in the back rooms of his father's business, in the apartments of men who collected debts with their fists, in the faces of women who had been taught to smile while they bled. He made a mental note. He filed it away. Then, 3 days before Marin's collapse, Gerald the doorman, who happened to be the cousin of a man who worked on one of Derek's construction crews, mentioned to his cousin that he was worried about a girl in his building, a young girl, college age, who had bruises that appeared and disappeared like weather, who got visits from a man in expensive suits who never signed in, who had stopped smiling 8 months ago. The cousin mentioned it to his foreman. The foreman mentioned it to Derek's head of security, a former federal agent named John Cole. John ran the name. He ran Russell's name. He connected the dots. And then he walked into Derek's office and said, "We have a situation." Derek listened. He asked questions. He did not react. And when John was finished, Derek said 3 words: "Find out everything." In the 72 hours between that conversation and Marin's hospitalization, John Cole and a team of 4 investigators assembled a file on Russell Graves that was more comprehensive than anything the FBI had compiled in 10 years of casual interest. They found 3 other women, all younger than 30, all of whom had signed non-disclosure agreements and received payments ranging from $50,000 to $200,000. They obtained copies of the NDAs. They found the payments in Russell's financial records, routed through a shell company called Bright Harbor Consulting, LLC, that had no employees, no office, and no purpose except to launder hush money. They obtained security footage from Marin's apartment building that showed Russell entering on 14 separate occasions in the last 3 months. Always late at night, always staying for hours, always leaving before dawn. They obtained phone records that showed a pattern of controlling communication. Dozens of texts per day, GPS tracking enabled on Marin's phone through an app Russell had installed without her knowledge. They found a private detective Russell had hired to monitor Marin's movements, a disgraced former cop named Ray Telford, who was more than happy to provide a detailed accounting of his surveillance when John presented him with an alternative that was considerably less appealing than cooperation. And by the time Marin collapsed in her lobby and Gerald called 911 instead of Russell, Derek King already knew. He knew who Russell was. He knew what Russell had done. He knew the shape and scope and machinery of Russell's abuse. And he had already decided what he was going to do about it. He just hadn't expected to do it tonight. The call from John came at 11:45 p.m. She's at St. Augustine, cardiac unit. Graves is already there. He's trying to get her discharged. Derek was at his desk in the penthouse office of the Meridian Hotel. He closed his laptop. He stood. He straightened his jacket. And he said, "Call Victor and Sante. We're going to the hospital." Now at 12:34 a.m., Derek King stood in the cardiac unit of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, and the air in the corridor had changed the way air changes before a thunderstorm. Charged, heavy, dangerous. Russell Graves was standing near the nurse's station, phone in hand, mid-conversation with Karen Brightwell about containment options. He saw Derek enter. He recognized him immediately, and in Russell's eyes there was a flicker of something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to share a zip code. "Mr. King," Russell said, pocketing his phone with the casual grace of a man who has practiced looking unbothered. "I didn't know you had business at this hospital." "I don't," Derek said. "I have business with you." The corridor was quiet. Even the night shift nurses were watching from their station. 2 security guards hovered near the elevator, unsure of their jurisdiction. Claudette Ashby stood in the doorway of room 7, clutching her purse with both hands. Russell smiled. It was the smile he used in debates, amused, dismissive, designed to make the other person feel small. "I'm not sure what business you could possibly have with me, Mr. King. We don't exactly run in the same circles." "No," Derek agreed. Your circles tend to include 22-year-old girls you keep on leashes." The smile stayed, but the eyes died. "I'm going to assume you're referring to my partner's daughter, who is here under medical care and whose situation is a private family matter. I'd suggest you reconsider whatever you think you're doing." "I've considered it." "Then let me make it clearer." Russell took a step forward, lowered his voice. They deployed the tone he used in closed-door negotiations with opposing counsel, the one that communicated, without explicit threat, that consequences were imminent. "I am a United States Senator. I am a personal friend of the mayor and the chief of police. I sit on the Judiciary Committee. I fund this hospital. I fund this floor. You are a man with 2 arrests and a construction company. If you don't walk out of this building in the next 30 seconds, I will make 1 phone call, and you will be escorted out in handcuffs." Derek didn't move. He didn't blink. He stood in the center of the corridor with his hands at his sides and looked at Russell Graves the way a man looks at an insect on a windshield, with no emotion at all. "You don't own her," Derek said. "I practically built this hospital." "You built a wing. I'm talking about a person." "And who are you to her?" "Some stranger who walked in off the street." "You have no legal standing. No family connection, no authority. You're nothing. Maybe, Derek said. But I'm nothing with a file on you that's 3 inches thick. Russell's smile flickered. What file? Derek reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, aware that every eye in the corridor was on him, and produced a single sheet of paper. He held it up. On it were 3 names, 3 dates, and $3 amounts. 3 women, Derek said. All under 30. All paid through Bright Harbor Consulting. All signed N.D., as that a first-year law student could get thrown out. You want to talk about legal standing? Let's talk about yours. For the first time in possibly decades, Russell Graves did not have a response prepared. His jaw worked, his eyes moved. To the paper, to Derek, to the nurses watching, to the security guards. Back to Derek. He was calculating, running scenarios, looking for the play. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't find one. You're bluffing, he said. Okay, I don't bluff. Ask anyone. Where did you get? That's stolen. That's illegally obtained. None of that would be admissible. I'm not a court. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not constrained by rules of evidence, Senator. I'm a man who builds things. And right now, I'm building the worst night of your life. Russell's mask was slipping. The controlled facade, the one that had won 3 elections, charmed 1,000 donors, convinced a city he was its protector, was cracking from the inside out. And his voice when he spoke had an edge it didn't usually have, a raw edge, the edge of a man who has always held the power in every room and who is suddenly, viscerally, aware that the room has changed. You think you can walk into a hospital and threaten a sitting senator? Do you have any idea? I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. Derek folded the paper, returned it to his pocket, and then looked Russell in the eyes with a stillness that was more terrifying than any raised voice could have been. You're going to leave this hospital. You're going to leave that girl alone. You're going to cancel whatever calls you made to Dr. Preston and Jeffrey Holt. And you're going to go home and start thinking about what your life looks like when this file reaches the people I've already told it exists. What people? The people who run the newspapers you can't buy. The federal investigators you can't call. The women you thought you silenced, who are currently sitting in a conference room with my attorneys, reconsidering their NDAs. Russell went pale. Not the dramatic movie pale of a man receiving bad news, but the real pale. The kind that starts at the lips and moves inward, the body redirecting blood to the organs it will need for survival. You're lying. I never lie. It's inefficient. A door opened behind them. Dr. Beam Vasquez stepped into the corridor. She looked at Derek. She looked at Russell. She looked at the security guards and the nurses and Claudette Ashby, who was still standing in the doorway of room 7 with her purse clutched to her chest like a shield. Gentlemen, Dr. Vasquez said, this is a hospital. Whatever this is, take it outside. Gladly, Russell said. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cufflinks, the same gesture Marin had described, and the one he performed after every act of violence, like a reset button on his humanity. This isn't over. No, Derek agreed. It isn't. Russell walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. The doors opened. He stepped inside, and just before the doors closed, he turned and looked at Derek King with the expression of a man who has not yet realized he is already falling. Oh, you have no idea who you're dealing with, he said. The doors closed. Derek stood in the corridor for a full 10 seconds after Russell was gone. Then he turned to Dr. Vasquez. That footage he tried to delete. You have backup? Dr. Vasquez looked at him. I have my own records. Good. Don't let anyone near them. He turned to Denise, the nurse who saw the slap. That's you? Denise nodded. Would you be willing to make a formal statement? I already wrote one. It's in my locker. Something shifted in Derek's expression. Not warmth. That wasn't a word anyone would use to describe Derek King, but something close to respect. Good, he said. Then we have everything we need. He turned to the doorway of room 7. Claudette was still standing there, her face a wreck of competing emotions, fear, guilt, confusion, and the slow, sickening recognition that the foundation she had built her life on was made of sand. Derek looked at her and said nothing. He didn't need to. She stepped aside. Derek walked into the room. Maren was on the bed, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. The monitor showed her heart rate at 119, still elevated, but lower than it had been. She looked up when he entered. "He'll come back," she said. "He always comes back." "Not tonight," Derek said. "You don't know him. You don't know what he can do." "I know exactly what he can do. And I know what I can do. Oh, and I promise you, on everything I've built and everything I own, he will never touch you again." Maren stared at him. In her eyes was the warfare of a mind that had been conditioned to trust no one, believe nothing, and expect the worst from every direction. "Yeah, why?" she asked. "Why do you care?" Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone should." He didn't stay long, 5 minutes. He didn't touch her. He didn't sit on the bed. And he stood at a respectful distance and spoke in a voice that was measured and calm and entirely devoid of the performative warmth that Russell used as a weapon. Before he left, he placed a business card on the tray beside her bed. "John Cole. He's my head of security. If you need anything, anything at all, you call that number, day or night." She picked up the card. Her hands were still trembling, but less. Derek walked out of the room. He nodded to Dr. Vasquez. He nodded to Denise. Then he walked down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the security guards, past the elevator, and out of the hospital. In the car, John was waiting. "He's going to go nuclear," John said. "I know. He has the police. He has the DA. He has the media." "I know. So what's the play?" Derek looked out the window. The city was dark. The hospital glowed behind them like a lighthouse in a storm. "We give him 24 hours to make his move. Then we make ours." Russell Graves did not sleep that night. He sat in the study of his townhouse, a room lined with mahogany bookshelves and framed photographs of himself, with governors, CEOs, and 2 former presidents, and he made phone calls. By 3 a.m., he had assembled what his chief of staff, Karen Brightwell, later described as a full response architecture. The architecture had 3 pillars. First, legal suppression. Russell's personal attorney, a man named Charles Wren, filed an emergency restraining order against Derek King at 7 a.m., citing harassment and intimidation of a public official. Simultaneously, Wren sent cease and desist letters to every media outlet in the city, warning of defamatory materials that might be circulated by criminal elements with a personal vendetta. It's his second, narrative control. Karen Brightwell drafted a statement positioning Russell as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by organized crime figures who were attempting to silence his anti-corruption work in the state Senate. The statement was distributed to every major newsroom by 8 a.m., along with a package of background materials highlighting Derek's 2 arrests and his family's alleged ties to organized crime. Third, institutional pressure. Russell called the chief of police, the district attorney, and the chairman of the hospital board. By 9 a.m., 2 uniformed officers had been dispatched to St. Augustine Memorial with instructions to ensure that the senator's family situation was handled discreetly. The DA's office issued a statement expressing concern about reports of witness intimidation at a local hospital. And the hospital board, in an emergency call convened at 8:30 a.m., voted to review the employment of any staff members who had provided unauthorized information to outside parties, a transparent threat aimed at Dr. Vasquez and Denise Okafor. At 10 a.m., Russell held a press conference on the steps of the state capitol. He was magnificent. 25 years of political performance had been leading to this moment, and Russell delivered with the precision of a concert pianist, playing a piece he has rehearsed 10,000 times. His voice broke at exactly the right moments. His eyes glistened with emotion that looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like genuine anguish. "I am here today because my family is under attack," he said, standing behind a podium flanked by American flags and two colleagues who had been drafted to stand beside him as props of solidarity. My partner Claudette and her daughter Moran are the most important people in my life. Moran has been struggling with anxiety and mental health challenges. Last night, while she was receiving treatment at St. Augustine Memorial, a man with known ties to criminal organizations forced his way into the hospital and attempted to interfere with her care. He paused, let the cameras catch his jaw tightening, let the reporters lean in. This man, Derek King, is not a concerned citizen. He is not a family friend. He is a convicted criminal. Arrested, not convicted, a reporter in the third row murmured. Inainini, who is using my family's private medical situation as leverage in what I can only describe as an extortion attempt. He presented forged documents, he made threats, he attempted to turn hospital staff against a sitting senator, and I want to be very clear, I will not be intimidated. Not by criminals, not by anyone. The questions came fast. Russell fielded them with practiced ease. He deflected. He reframed. He turned every question into an opportunity to reinforce the narrative. He was the protector. Marin was the patient. Derek was the villain. By noon, the story was leading every local news broadcast. Senator targeted by organized crime figure at hospital. The angle was exactly what Russell wanted. A powerful man under siege, fighting to protect his family from the forces of darkness. And for about 6 hours, it worked. At 4:47 p.m., Derek King released the first piece of evidence. It appeared simultaneously on the websites of 3 news outlets, 2 local, 1 national, that had been identified by John Cole as editorially independent and not financially connected to Russell Graves or any of his allies. The outlets had been contacted at 9 a.m., given the materials at noon, and had spent 4 hours verifying, consulting legal counsel, and agonizing over the decision to publish. They published. The first piece was the security footage from the hospital corridor. Not the footage Russell had tried to delete. That was gone, archived into a digital void by Jeffrey Holt's compliant IT team. This was different. This was footage from a camera that Russell didn't know about, a camera installed 6 months earlier as part of a hospital safety upgrade. Positioned at the junction of 2 corridors, covering a wider angle than the standard ceiling cameras. The footage showed Russell entering Marin's room. It showed the door closing, and 12 minutes later, and it showed the door opening and Russell walking out, followed 30 seconds later by Denise Okafor rushing into the room. It didn't show the slap itself, the camera angle didn't reach into the room, but it showed the timeline, it showed the sequence, and it showed Russell's face as he walked out. The jaws set, the eyes flat, the mechanical cuff adjustment that Marin had described, the expression of a man who has just done something and is already calculating how to make it disappear. The second piece, released 40 minutes later, was an audio recording. John Cole had obtained it from Ray Telford, the private detective Russell had hired to monitor Marin. Telford, who recorded all his client interactions as a matter of professional habit, had captured a phone conversation in which Russell instructed him to make sure she doesn't leave the building without me knowing about it, and, more damningly, to find out who she's talking to and shut it down. I don't care how. The third piece was the financial documentation, shell company records, wire transfers, 3 payments to 3 women, routed through Bright Harbor Consulting LLC, all made within 30 days of each woman signing a non-disclosure agreement. The documents had been obtained through legitimate and the accompanying payment record, and she had provided them voluntarily after meeting with Derek's legal team. The fourth piece was the most devastating. At 6:15 p.m., Denise Okafor appeared on camera for a live interview with a national news network. She was still in her scrubs. She had been awake for 36 hours. Her hands were steady. She described what she had seen. The slap, the raised hand, Marin's head turning, Russell's face, the mask reassembling. The lie he told her. She gets hysterical. She described what happened after, the calls, the pressure. Doctor. in Preston, arriving at 11 p.m. to override a cardiologist's medical judgment. The security footage being archived. The hospital counsel threatening the medical staff. The two police officers who arrived in the morning and stood outside Marin's room for her protection, which everyone on the floor understood to mean for the senator's protection. She described it all in the flat, precise, factual language of a woman who has spent 11 years documenting vital signs and who understands that the most important information is the information you don't editorialized. The interviewer asked, "Why are you coming forward?" Denise looked into the camera and said, "Because I took an oath to protect my patients. And right now, the biggest threat to my patient isn't her heart rate. It's the man who put her in that bed." The interview went viral within 40 minutes. By 7 p.m., every major network was running it. By 8 p.m., the hashtag Protect Marin was trending nationally. By 9 p.m., the first of Russell's corporate sponsors had issued a statement expressing concern and reviewing our relationship with the senator's office. By 10 p.m., Claudette Ashby broke. She appeared at the hospital, not the polished, controlled Claudette who had arrived the night before with instructions to get her daughter out. This was a different woman, and she was wearing the same clothes from the previous day. Her hair was unwashed, her makeup was gone. She looked like someone who had aged 10 years in 24 hours, because she had. She walked into Marin's room, where Dr. Vasquez was monitoring vitals, and John Cole's team had stationed a private security guard outside the door. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She took her daughter's hand, and she said, "I'm sorry." Marin didn't respond. "I knew," Claudette said. "Not everything, but enough. I knew he was controlling you. I saw the way you changed. I saw the way your voice got smaller, and your world got smaller, and the light in your eyes went out. I saw it, and I told myself, it was because you were growing up, because you were adjusting, because that's what happens when you're with a powerful man. You become part of his world, and your world disappears, and that's just the cost." She was crying now, not the performed tears of a woman seeking sympathy, but the ugly, gasping tears of genuine devastation. "I let it happen because I was tired. I was so tired, Marin. 30 years of fighting and scraping, and worrying about money, and raising you alone and never having enough, and always being afraid. And then Russell came along and he made it all stop. The fear stopped. The worry stopped. He took care of everything, and I was so grateful, so desperately grateful, that I closed my eyes. I closed my eyes and I let you pay the price for my relief." Marin's chin trembled. She still didn't speak. "When that nurse said she saw him hit you, something broke inside me. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. I wasn't surprised, Marin. And that's what broke me. The fact that I wasn't surprised." She pressed her daughter's hand to her forehead. Her shoulders shook. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. I will spend the rest of my life knowing that I chose comfort over my own child. But I want you to know that I see you now. I see what he did. And I will never, ever close my eyes again." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The monitor beeped. The IV dripped. The fluorescent light hummed. Then, Marin said, in a voice that was barely audible, "Did you tell anyone?" "I'm going to tell everyone." At 10:47 p.m., Claudette Ashby walked out of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital and into a waiting car. She was driven to a law office downtown, where 3 attorneys, retained by Derek King but working independently under client-attorney privilege for Marin and Claudette, were waiting. She gave a statement. It took 3 hours. She described everything: the introduction, the escalation, the signs she ignored, the conversations she had with Russell, where he explained patiently and persuasively, and that Marin was fragile and needed structure. The times Claudette had told Marin to be more grateful. The times she had dismissed her daughter's tears as immaturity. She held nothing back. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Russell Graves was awakened by a call from Karen Brightwell. "Turn on the news," Karen said. Russell read. Claudette Ashby's statement had been released simultaneously by 3 news outlets, and accompanied by the medical records Dr. Vasquez had preserved. Additional security footage from Marron's apartment building, provided by Gerald the doorman, and sworn affidavits from 2 of the 3 women who had previously signed NDAs that were now being challenged in court as products of coercion. The headline on every screen read, "Senator Graves accused of domestic abuse, cover-up." Russell stared at the screen. For the first time in his life, he had no plan, no response architecture, no team of fixers and lawyers and allies. Because the infrastructure he had spent 25 years building, the favors, the donations, the relationships, the leverage, was crumbling in real time, live on national television, and there was no phone call he could make, no pressure he could apply, no check he could write that would stop it. His phone lit up with messages, sponsors withdrawing, colleagues distancing, his chief of staff sending a resignation letter at 6:14 a.m. In the state party chairman calling to inform him that an emergency meeting had been convened to discuss his future. At 7 a.m., the FBI's Public Corruption Unit announced that it had opened a formal investigation into Senator Russell Graves, citing credible allegations of abuse of power, witness intimidation, and obstruction. At 8 a.m., the State Medical Board announced an investigation into St. Augustine Memorial Hospital's handling of patient records and staff protections. At 9 a.m., the State Bar Association opened a review of Charles Wren's conduct in filing the restraining order against Derek King, citing potential abuse of legal process. At 10 a.m., Russell Graves released a statement through what remained of his press operation. It was 2 sentences long. "I categorically deny all allegations. I will cooperate fully with any investigation." Nobody believed him. The arrest happened on a Wednesday, 7 days after Marin's hospitalization, 5 days after Derek's intervention, 3 days after the story went national. Russell Graves was arrested at his townhouse at 6:45 a.m. by 2 FBI agents and 4 officers from the state police, deliberately chosen instead of local police, whose chief was under scrutiny for his close relationship with the senator. And Russell was wearing a bathrobe and slippers. And he was not handcuffed initially, a professional courtesy extended to public officials that would later draw criticism. But when a photographer from a news helicopter captured the image of Russell being escorted to an unmarked vehicle, the absence of handcuffs didn't matter. The image was everywhere within the hour. The bathrobe became iconic. Those social media turned it into a symbol of the gap between the public facade and the private reality. The senator who had stood at podiums in $3,000 suits, now shuffling across his driveway in terry cloth. The charges were substantial. 2 counts of assault, 1 count of coercion, 1 count of witness tampering, 1 count of obstruction of justice, 1 count of abuse of public office. Additional charges were expected as the federal investigation expanded. Bail was set at $500,000. Russell posted it within 2 hours, but the bail was almost irrelevant. By the time he walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, his life had been dismantled with a thoroughness that no amount of money could reverse. His Senate seat was effectively forfeit. The state party had demanded his resignation. When he refused, impeachment proceedings began. His law license was suspended pending investigation. And his bank accounts were frozen under a federal hold related to the Bright Harbor Consulting money trail. His membership in every club, board, and professional organization he had ever joined was revoked or suspended. The hospital board stripped his name from the cardiology wing, literally, physically, a crew arriving at 8 a.m. on Thursday to remove the brass plaque with power tools. The women came forward, first the 2 who had given affidavits through Derek's legal team, then the third, who had been the most reluctant, who had held back, out of fear, until she saw Denise Okafor's interview and realized that silence was no longer a form of protection. Then a 4th woman, one no one had known about, who had been a legislative aide in Russell's Senate office 6 years earlier, and who had endured 11 months of what she described as a systematic campaign to make me believe I was crazy. Their stories were different in detail, but identical in architecture, the initial charm, and the gradual isolation, the control disguised as care, the violence, sometimes physical, sometimes purely psychological, calibrated to break without leaving visible marks, the payments, the NDAs, the implicit and sometimes explicit threats about what would happen if they spoke. Dr. Vasquez's records were entered into evidence, her photographs, her clinical notes, the encrypted backup that Russell's people had never known about. Every bruise, every injury, every vital sign that told the story, Moran's words, couldn't. Jeffrey Holt, the hospital's director of operations, resigned. Dr. Edwin Preston, the chief of medicine, was placed on administrative leave. The hospital's general counsel, who had threatened the medical staff on Russell's behalf, was referred to the state bar. A full audit of the hospital's donor influence policies was initiated, with Denise Okafor serving on the committee that drafted the new protocols. Claudette Ashby did not face charges, though many argued she should have. Investigators determined that while her passivity had enabled the abuse, her eventual testimony was so comprehensive and so unflinching that prosecution would have been both legally weak and strategically counterproductive. Claudette accepted this ambiguous mercy with no visible relief. She told an interviewer, weeks later, "There is no punishment the court could give me that is worse than what I've already given myself." She moved out of Russell's apartment. She rented a small place on the other side of the city. She started therapy. She did not ask Marin for forgiveness because she understood that asking would be its own form of coercion, placing the burden of absolution on the person she had failed. Marin was discharged from the hospital on the 4th day. Her blood pressure had stabilized. Her heart rate was down to 82. The trembling in her hands had diminished to a fine vibration that was only visible when she held something light. A cup of water, a pen. She was moved to a private facility, not a hospital, but a residential care center that specialized in trauma recovery, funded anonymously through a trust that Derek King's legal team had established. The care team included a trauma psychologist, a psychiatric nurse, and a physical therapist who specialized in the somatic effects of prolonged stress. Marin would spend 8 weeks there. She would not give interviews during that time. She would not read the news. She would not respond to the hundreds of messages that flooded her phone from strangers who had seen her name and wanted to tell her she was brave. She did not feel brave. She felt hollowed out. She felt like a house after a fire, the structure standing, the walls intact, but everything inside reduced to ash and silence. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Leora Sims, told Marin during their first session, "You are not broken. You are responding normally to an abnormal situation. Every symptom you're experiencing, the dissociation, the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the numbness, these are evidence of your survival. Your mind did exactly what it needed to do to keep you alive." Marin looked at her and said, "What if I don't know who I am without him?" "Then we find out," Dr. Sims said. "Together, at your pace." The trial was set for the following spring. Russell's legal team, now consisting of attorneys who had taken the case as a career gamble rather than a professional obligation, attempted every procedural delay available. They filed motions to suppress, and they challenged the admissibility of the security footage, the audio recordings, the financial documents. They argued that Derek King's involvement constituted illegal investigation by a private citizen with ulterior motives. The judge, a federal appointee with no connection to Russell's political network, denied every motion. Marin testified on the 3rd day of the trial. She walked into the courtroom wearing a simple navy dress and no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was pale, and her hands were steady. She sat in the witness chair, and she told the truth. She described the first meeting, the gradual escalation, The texts, the isolation, the gaslighting. She used that word specifically because Dr. Sims had taught her the language to name what had been done to her, and the naming itself was a form of reclamation. She described the first hit, the second, the pattern, the flowers that always came after, and the way her world shrank until it was the size of a studio apartment with a doorman who reported to her abuser. She described the night in the hospital, the phone message, Russell's arrival, the demand that she love, the slap, the look on his face, not rage but irritation, as if she were a machine that had malfunctioned and he was resetting it with a firm hand. She described the way her mother had responded, without anger, without judgment. She said, "My mother was a victim too, and she just didn't know it, or she knew it and couldn't face it. Either way, she was trapped in the same cage I was. It just looked different from the outside." She testified for 4 hours. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She answered every question, including the ones from Russell's defense attorneys that were designed to humiliate, to confuse, to recreate in the courtroom the same dynamic of control that Russell had wielded in private, with a clarity that stunned the room. And when the defense attorney suggested that Marin had been a willing participant in the relationship and had benefited financially from Russell's generosity, Marin looked at him and said, "A cage with a silk lining is still a cage." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Russell Graves was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read. His attorneys filed an appeal. It was denied. After the trial, Marin did not hold a press conference. She did not write a book. She did not become a spokesperson or a symbol or a hashtag. She went back to the care center. She continued her therapy. She re-enrolled at Whitmore University for the fall semester. She got a new apartment, one she found herself, one she paid for with her own savings, and a part-time job at a bookstore near campus. It was small. The windows faced east. The light in the morning was pale gold. She still had panic attacks, as though they came less frequently. She still flinched at loud sounds, though the flinch was smaller now. She still checked her phone compulsively, though the compulsion was fading, the intervals between checks growing longer. 10 minutes, 20, an hour, a morning. She was not healed. She was not whole. She was not the girl she had been before Russell Graves walked into her life and systematically dismantled everything she believed about herself. That girl was gone. But the woman who remained, the one who walked across the Whitmore campus on a crisp autumn morning, book bag over one shoulder, coffee in hand, chin lifted to catch the sunlight, that woman was something Russell had never anticipated and could never control. She was someone who had survived. 3 months after the verdict, Marin was walking across the quad when she stopped. She had felt something, not a panic attack, not a flashback, but a strange, an unfamiliar sensation that she couldn't immediately identify. It took her a moment, and then she recognized it. It was peace, not the absence of pain, not the erasure of memory, but a small, warm, quiet feeling that existed alongside everything else. The fear, the grief, the anger, the loss, without being diminished by them. It was the first time she had felt it in over 2 years. She stood still and let it wash through her, like sunlight through glass. Then she kept walking across the street. In a black car with tinted windows, Derek King watched her go. He did not get out of the car. He did not call her name. He did not congratulate himself or send flowers or expect gratitude. He sat in the back seat with his hands folded, and he watched a 23-year-old woman walk across a university campus with her chin up and her shoulders straight, and he felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, something that had no utility, no strategic value, no application to the world of hotels and construction and the careful architecture of power. He felt hope. John, in the driver's seat, glanced in the rearview mirror. Back to the office? Derek watched Marin until she disappeared through the doors of the political science building. "Yeah," he said, back to the office. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic. The campus disappeared behind them. The city moved on. And somewhere in a small apartment with east-facing windows, a young woman's books were stacked on a desk. A thesis outline was pinned to a corkboard, and the first draft of a new chapter was waiting to be written. Not Russell's chapter.